These are the parts that are included in the Shaftmaster tune-up kit. We have the cage bearings, 2 sets, the stationary bearings, the lower radius inserts, and the socket chuck checker. First we're going to check the condition of the socket chuck. To do that, we're going to use the socket chuck checker. Simply insert that into the socket chuck. Tighten the set screw, but don't over tighten it. Use your dial indicator. And rotate your socket chuck and check the movement. This one's about 1/1000ths. If you get a reading of over 5 to 7 thousandths or more, you need to consider replacing your socket chuck for the best performance of balancing. First we'll need to take the socket chuck out to get to the bearings. On models equipped with an auto weld, it'll have this aluminum pulley on there. First we'll need to loosen the set screws that hold that pulley onto the socket chuck. Then we can slide that pulley back and it exposes the snap ring. Then we can move the set screws that hold the coupling to the end of the small shaft that's in the end of the socket chuck. Next we'll take a punch and hammer and we will drive the roll pin out until it's almost all the way out. Next we'll take our snap ring pliers and remove it from the end of the socket chuck. Now we can remove the socket chuck. To replace the stationary bearing, we'll first have to take off the bearing retainer by taking loose the 3 bolts that hold that on. With the bolts out, we can remove the bearing retainer. Some of these bearings may be a slight press fit into the housing. This one does slide out with fair amount of ease. If the bearing doesn't come out very easily, you can use these 832 screws as jack bolts and simply screw them in. And the bearing will come out. With our new bearing, we're going to set this in the bore and lightly tap, get the bearing square until it falls into the bore. Then we're going to return our bearing retainer back on, put in our 3 screws, and our belt holder for the auto weld assembly. And snug up those bolts. To remove the bearing cage, we're simply going to rotate it to the floating position. Pull back on your indicator shaft and rotate the cage out of its support. Here we have our bearing cage that we've removed from the Shaftmaster. We're ready to take it apart. First we'll start by taking off our knobs. We'll remove our bolts. Now we can remove our bearing retainer. Our bearing should slide out fairly freely. And there you have the bearings. With the bearings out, you want to completely clean the inside and the outside of the cage, probably with a brake clean. Now that we have our bearing cage cleaned up, free of any contaminants, we're ready to install the new bearings. First I take and put a coating of oil on the inside of the cage. With our new bearings, there are a wrong and a right way to put these in. This is the right way, with the more open part of the bearing facing together. Notice that this side is more enclosed. So again, the most open part of the bearings together. Take the bearings, put a coating of this 10-weight oil on the bearings. And install those into the bearing cage. It should slide in fairly easily. Now there is a Teflon seal on the cage. If those get damaged or need replaced, they can be gotten also. I always line up the seal with the hole in it in the cage to the retainer so they're both on the same side. When we install our bolts, I use a small amount of medium strength Loctite on the bolts. Tighten those only finger tight at this time. Replace the knob assembly. We can very lightly tighten up our bolts. And we'll finish tightening those when we have the cage in the Shaftmaster in the bearing support. While we have the bearing cage out, this is a good time to inspect the support. These radius areas can have a tendency to get burred up. If they do, use a light file or emery cloth to clean up these surfaces, both top and bottom. Sometimes our radius insert needs to be replaced. It gets burred up and it can develop a flat spot where the bearing cage rides on that over a lot of use. So we will need to replace this bearing radius insert. To do that, remove these bolts. With the bolts loose, we can now remove our radius insert. Simply lift up and out of the way. While we have that out, we can take and clean any contaminant that has gotten built up in the support area. Use of brake clean wouldn't be a bad idea. With our new radius insert, we're simply going to install the bolts into the holes. It's not a bad idea to use a small drop of Loctite, medium strength, on the bolts, and install that back into the bottom of the support and tighten the bolts. The radius insert does have some movement back and forth. While tightening your bolts, try to center that radius insert in the opening and then snug your bolts. While we have the cage out, this is a good time to check the function of the dial indicator. Make sure that it is moving freely. At the same time, check the plunger on the dial shaft and make sure that it is moving freely. At this time, we're ready for reassembly. To start, we're going to put a straight 10-weight oil on our radius areas. To get the upper radius area, I'm just going to put some on my finger and rub that upper surface. With our bearings in our cage and our bolts finger tight, we're going to return the bearing cage to the support. Pull out the indicator shaft and pivot the cage into the support and rotate the cage into the lock position. We will then take our oil and lubricate the inner race of both bearings. Now we're ready to install our socket chuck. Simply slide the socket chuck through the first bearing and line it up with the stationary bearing. The stationary bearing is a self-aligning bearing, and a little tap might be needed to get it to start into the stationary bearing. At this point, now we can continue the process of tightening the bolts on the retainer that holds the bearings into the cage. Gradually tighten each of the 6 bolts. A little at a time, and feel the drag or preload that's put on the socket chuck. Continue tightening the bolts, again a little at a time, and feel the movement of the socket chuck again. The right movement or tightness of the bolts is when you got drag on the socket chuck and the cage does not move in and out with it. If you over tighten the bolts, the cage may want to move in and out with the socket chuck because it's too tight. Now that we have our bolts tight on our cage, let's slide the socket chuck back out partially. Now we can make sure our belt is back in there. I take the snap ring and actually put it on the pliers and hold it in place on our brass collar. Then we take our auto weld pulley and slide that into position. While holding the pulley, we're going to gently bring our socket chuck back into the stationary bearing and through the aluminum pulley. After starting the aluminum pulley onto the socket chuck, we now need to align the shaft that's at the end of the socket chuck into our drive coupling. Rotate that onto that coupling. I use a tapered punch and move that around so it drops into where the roll pin would go. Now I have that roughly centered for our roll pin. I try to rotate both items at once and bring our roll pin that's still in the other side of the coupling and tap that roll pin into the small shaft at the end of the socket chuck. Take your punch and drive that roll pin as centered as you can on both sides. Reinstall the set screws you took out, one on each side of the roll pin. Try to make sure that both set screws are in about the same amount. In this case, I'll loosen up this one a little bit, and I'll turn this one in. Once you have both of them roughly centered, make sure both of them are snugged up. Now that we have our coupling attached, we can finish sliding our socket chuck in, slide our aluminum collar all the way in, and put our snap ring back on the end of the shaft. With our snap ring on, we can now slide the aluminum pulley back up to the snap ring and tighten those two set screws. With the belt in position on its holder, we're done replacing the bearings. The process of replacing the bearings in the tail section of the Shaftmaster is very similar to the head end, but it is a lot more simplified because we don't have the coupler to take apart at this end. Simply remove the snap ring and the socket chuck will slide right out, and the bearing replacement is similar as the other end.